You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
I didn't really introduce myself. If we haven't met, my name's Scott. I'm one of the pastors here, and no matter how long you've been here, I'm not sure how many of you know the history of our church. And there's all sorts of different ways we could tell that story, all different angles you could tell the story of the local church here, Cornerstone, West LA. There's all sorts of angles you could tell it from. You could tell it from the angle of our facility here that's been on the corner of Idaho and Barrington since the 1920s, built on the outskirts of the town of Sawtell back then. You could tell this story from when First Baptist Church of West Los Angeles was founded in 1901. You could tell it through the stories of numerous different people who've been here in generations, of people who faithfully serving the Lord through all sorts of different ways. And you could really tell it from any different story, any different one of your stories that has intersected with the body here for any amount of time, or any other people that have come and gone. But obviously the best way I know how to tell the story is from my own perspective. I've been pastoring this body. It'll be 14 years in October, along with Brian, and it was in 2005. So the story from my perspective is from 2005, Brian and I planted a church here in West LA together, along with actually just a few of you. Matt was a freshman at UCLA. Laura was pregnant with our now teenage son. Brian was single and oblivious to the amazing girl named Chrissy who was hanging around with the church plant as well. Blockbuster Video was still on Venice. That's actually where we rented our movies from. It was a different world. No, but during that time, there actually used to be a Christian school, a small Christian school here on this campus, and at that Christian school in 2005, or actually, beginning in 2006, I began teaching at this Christian school. I was looking for a job. We were planting a church, and I was looking for a job, looking for something to pay the bills and support this new family we had. And I knew the senior pastor at First Baptist Church of West LA at the time, Jerry Wilkie, and asked him, do you know anybody who is hiring for anything that somebody who has a seminary degree could do? And he referred me to the principal at the school, and the principal said, well, I have one opening for a PE teacher. And I told him, I like sports. And he said, you're hired. So there we go. And that's actually how I began to build a relationship with the people and the Church of First Baptist Church of West LA. And during the years of that church plant, our family had a lot of young people as a part of the church, college students, people just out of college. Like I said, Laura was pregnant with our son Harper. Harper was the first kid in the entire church. He was the children's ministry. Until 2 years later, when Addison was born, and she was the second kid in the entire church, and the two of them, our children's ministry consisted of babysitting for Scott and Laura. But God was faithful and continued to grow and develop his church, and between 2005 2010, the church grew in number quicker than it grew in life stage, right? It grew, but the life stage of the church didn't really change all that much. And in 2010, one of the associate pastors here at First Baptist Church of West LA, which was meeting here and has been here since the 20s, reached out to me and said, we had become friends over the years, and he said, I was thinking, we were praying, we were talking, what if we merged our two churches together? And I told him, I think that's a horrible idea. I honestly did. That was my first reaction. And because, as I thought about what that would mean, very quickly I realized that I liked being an independent church that could kind of do whatever it wanted. I liked being a smaller group of Christians who could shape the church to be exactly what we wanted it to be. I liked doing things the way I liked to do them. But as it turns out, that's not the point of the church. The more we prayed and sought God, the more we sought to explore what He wanted for His church, the more we came to realize that God was actually doing something through that suggestion that was bigger than we even ever realized or really thought possible. The question we needed to be asking wasn't, what do I want this church to be? The question was, what does God want this church to be? What is God building His church to be? And to find that out, we can't simply reflect on our own desires. We have to open up His Word. And so to make a long and, complicated and beautiful story really short, after a lot of conversation and praying and seeking and searching, we determined, both as pastors and as church bodies, that the truth was we were actually better together than we were apart. The First Baptist Church was filled with some older people, some families, some ethnic diversity, and a legacy of loving God and teaching the Word faithfully. Shoreline Church, which was the name of our church plant, which kept moving away from the shoreline as we went through the years, but was filled with younger people, had a vision for how we would reach the next generation, and a passion for our city. But the differences between us weren't reasons that we shouldn't join together. In fact, we came to realize that the differences between us were the reasons that we should. The truth was we're better together, and this concept, the idea that we're better together became our go-to explanation for why we were joining together, because the truth was we were. And after all, we read it on almost every page of the New Testament, right? Like we would, no matter where you're reading and searching the New Testament, it becomes obvious that God creates His body with all sorts of differences, with all sorts of diversities, breaking down all sorts of different walls for the sake of His glory and for the sake of the beauty of His love making itself known and working out in the world. And so in 2011, we joined together. Shoreline Church, First Baptist Church, joined together, became Cornerstone Church of West LA. We became a church of old and young. We became a church of single people and families. We became a church of people from all sorts of different states across the country and all sorts of countries across the world. But what we didn't know was that the Lord wasn't done yet. That wasn't like the big thing He was doing. I mean, it was a big thing He was doing, but He was continuing to build His church in all sorts of different ways. About a year later, we realized that there was a large portion of our community that God wanted to reach with the gospel that we didn't have access to yet. Spanish speakers. And so Jose Gonzalez, before he was Pastor Jose, simply started a small ministry to Spanish speakers in the neighborhood, a small Bible study, just reaching out to Spanish speakers in the neighborhood. He'd been pursuing a seminary training and begun to step away from his career as an architect and just wanted to invest and pour into people. But as the Lord drew people, people got baptized, as people got discipled, as the Lord was growing His body and drawing Spanish speakers throughout our community to Himself, the question quickly became, how should we, as an essentially English-speaking church, relate to this growing portion of our family that primarily spoke Spanish? And again, as we studied the Word of God and sought His guidance and direction, it became apparent that there was really only one choice. We were called to be one church because the truth was, we're better together. And so God was designing us to demonstrate the power of the gospel by striving to love one another and serve one another and grow from one another, learn from one another. God was calling us to recognize that language was just another barrier that He'd broken down. Of course, there's the logistical difficulty of that, and we've learned a lot along the way, but God has provided many ways for us to still be able to love one another, serve one another, demonstrate that unity, learn from one another. And as a result, for the past 5 years, we've also existed as a multilingual church that worships on Sundays in 2 different languages and regularly worships all together as we seek to build a larger community that shows how God breaks down walls that the world continues to maintain. I mean, those whose heart language is English and those whose heart language is Spanish don't normally experience much unity, right? They can view one another with suspicion. They can view one another with fear of judgment. They can view one another as the other in a diverse society. They rarely would come into the same place, and even more rarely express genuine love, care, concern for one another. Rarely live as a family together. But while that's exactly the way the culture works, unfortunately, God has called us to something radically different in the church. And over the past number of years, we haven't lived that out perfectly. We've been striving and made mistakes and learned as we've gone. But our pastors are striving to live that out more and more. And I know that many of your Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters are striving to live that out more and more. And I know that many of you as English speakers are striving to live that out more and more. Because together we're striving to live out the unity that God has created in us through Christ. And now, as we've been saying for the last few months, we believe that God is doing this type of thing again, continuing to mold and direct and guide his church in the way that he wants it to go. And I mean, I'll confess, like, I wish this was like some grandiose vision that, like, we were smart enough to have. But the reality is this is simply the church that God is choosing to build in our midst. For the past couple of years, God's been growing up a group of Farsi-speaking brothers and sisters in Christ, drawing Farsi speakers primarily from Iran to himself, being baptized and coming to faith in Christ and growing together. And they worship together in their own language at 5 p.m. every Sunday. And next week, a number of them are going to be becoming members of Cornerstone. Pastor Ara is going to be ordained as a pastor of Cornerstone. And God is continuing to grow this multilingual family. And like I was saying, what's fascinating about all of this is we never set out to be a multilingual church. This wasn't like some ideal that God has, like, oh, how do you be or try to become a multilingual church? When Brian and I planted Shoreline 14 years ago, we had no intention of this. Like, it wasn't like, again, like I wish I could say I was smart enough to think this up, but I wasn't. We weren't. Some of you were like, I've been praying for this for a while. I was, but we weren't. And honestly, like almost every time the Lord takes the church is starting to take the church in a different direction, my reaction's almost always the same as it was when the idea for merging the churches came to me for the first time. Like the Lord's like, I think we're going to take the church in this way, and I'm like, I'm not sure that's a good idea. That seems complicated, right? Like that seems messy. Like I'm not sure that's how I draw it up. And it's almost like the Lord is saying to all of us, right? I know. That's my point. Right? And that's why I'm in control. And we've seen this over and over. In this time over the past decade, God has orchestrated many things in the hearts of your pastors, in the hearts of many of you, through all sorts of sovereign directions. He sovereignly placed Jose here in 1991 as a Santa Monica College student. That's when he started attending First Baptist Church of West Los Angeles. Having no idea, and then went from there to UCLA, graduated from UCLA, went into architecture. Literally had a career in architecture. All the while, the Lord going, I'm just waiting. I know what's coming. I've got something in the works. He did the same thing drawing Pastor Ara and Jamie, this Farsi-speaking Kansas boy, from longtime missionary in Tajikistan, bringing the two of them together and then bringing them literally to our doorstep. The Monday after, on Sunday, we'd baptized 4 Farsi speakers. I've told you this story before, right? But 4 Farsi speakers get baptized on Sunday. We're like, I don't know how in the world we're going to disciple these people who are now new believers, but need to know about Jesus, because we don't have anybody who speaks Farsi, let alone a pastor, somebody of spiritual maturity. And the next morning, I got an email from Jamie saying, hey, we're a refugee pastor and a missionary just looking to disciple Farsi speakers. Seriously. Mind-boggling, just the Lord's direction and provision. At which point, you don't say, well, you know what, I had a different plan for the church. Right? The Lord's like, I'm doing something. It's time to listen. And we've been following just step by step all along. And not only but that, this isn't just a leadership thing. He's demonstrated it by over the last few years drawing dozens of Spanish speakers and Farsi speakers to himself, seeing them get baptized over and over and over. And so it's left us with complete clarity that this is something beautiful and unique and powerful that God's doing in our midst. And it's simply our job to follow his lead. And as our Farsi-speaking brothers and sisters prepare to officially join with us, we've been talking about these types of things, what it means to be one church with them. We've been talking recently with our Spanish speakers about what it means to be one church as well. And so it seemed like appropriate to spend some time, to spend a couple of weeks talking together with our English-speaking portion of our family about what this means as well. And on the very first Sunday of our merged church back in 2011, I preached a sermon entitled How to Merge a Church. Actually, Pastor Jim just happened to this week. He was going through, he's like, hey, I found these old CDs. Do you guys want this? This is May 1st, 2011, How to Merge a Church. This is a CD. You guys don't know. You put it in a machine, it spins. It's amazing. But we preached it from one of my favorite passages, and I think one of the most important passages for any of us as Christians and as the local church, from Philippians 2. And I believe that the key to being a multilingual church is the same to the key to merging a church. And so we're going to open up there. Our passage is Philippians 2, verses 1 through 8. Paul writes, so if there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Paul says, I want you to have the same mind. I want you to have this unity of mind. But how can this unity of mind even be possible when we're all so different, when we have so little in common, when we live such different lives, even in the same city? I think this kind of unity, in spite of our diversity, is possible because we have a common experience of receiving God's amazing grace through Christ. And having that common experience, we have a common identity as his children. And being his children makes us not like brothers and sisters. It makes us brothers and sisters. We actually are family. And in response to the gospel, God gives us an explanation of how he desires his family to interact with one another, how he calls his family to live. He says in verse 3, do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. And here's where the rubber hits the road. How do you be a multilingual church? How do you thrive in the family of God? He's saying by remembering Jesus and his sacrificial service on our behalf, and then by emulating him. By trying to be more and more like him and considering others more significant than yourselves. I think sometimes we try to play this down, right? We're like, okay, well, I get it. So I should act like people are more important than me. Or I should treat people like they're more important than me. He's like, no. I want you to actually think they are. This isn't just something to put on. This is deeper than that. I've even read commentaries, actually, that try to kind of wiggle out of this. Well, one of the commentators writes this. He says, this doesn't mean that we have to have a false or unrealistic view of our own gifts. He says, what Paul means is that our consideration for others must precede concern for ourselves. But read these verses carefully. Verse 4 says that our consideration of others must precede our current concern for ourselves. Verse 3 says something deeper. Verse 3 says, count others more significant than yourself. Regard one another as more important. He says, and if you ever wonder if okay, I don't want to be unrealistic. I don't want to be too radical. I'm at least kind of important. He says, the mind I want you to have is the mind of Christ. And he existed in the form of God from eternity past. And to set that aside out of love and consideration for us. He says he was in the form of God, but did not count equality with God a thing to be clung to, but humbled himself and became a human. God was born. And not only was God born, but he lived. He walked through life. He learned. He was dependent on others. He transitioned to became a man. And then God died. He humbled himself. He says not only till the point of death, he says even death on a cross. Dying a humiliating death, naked, tortured. He says this is the model that you would have to exceed if you were ever to say, well, I don't know, that sounds like it's a little bit too far. And since we can't start at God, I don't think there's any way we could ever exhaust the call to genuinely consider others more significant than ourselves. Jesus is calling us. He says, emulate me all the way to the cross. I think when we think about this barrier of language in particular, most of us wish that God would overcome the barrier of language like the way he did in Acts 2, just by allowing us to all miraculously speak other languages. And in fact, I think some of us actually think, maybe in the back of your mind, you're like, if God really wanted us to overcome this barrier, then he would have miraculously provided us the ability to speak other languages. But since he hasn't, maybe this barrier's, just one of those that's just kind of gonna stay there. But I don't believe that God hasn't given us the ability to miraculously speak one another's languages because that miracle is too big for what he wants to do. I think he hasn't provided us the ability to miraculously speak other languages because that miracle would be too small for what he intends to do. And what he intends to do is a much greater miracle than just being able to speak a language. He is interested in the miracle of transforming hearts. He's interested in the miracle of taking people who are by our very nature, in our sinful nature, prejudice, divided, continually self-aggrandizing and looking down on others, and so transform us, so change us, that we might actually live and love like Jesus, that we might love others and actually consider others more significant than ourselves. And in so doing, show a glory and a power that's far greater and far more impressive than even just speaking another language. He's going to transform us from the inside out. And it's this radical heart transformation that's the real answer to the how question. How do you merge a church? How do you live as a multilingual church? Through this kind of radical, inside-out transformation through the Spirit of God. Now, in a message on how to be a multilingual church, I know that you've been hoping to get some of your logistical questions answered because you're like, okay, but how? Cool, great, but how? And we're going to get there in a second. But the truth is, the only way to be a multi-anything, right? The kind of church that God has designed. God has designed a church. On every page in the New Testament, he's just breaking down walls, breaking down barriers constantly, drawing people into a miraculous unity. And the only way to do that is to consistently fight to emulate Christ by considering others more significant than ourselves. And when we fall away from that kind of other-focused love, the genuine church falls apart. Or it turns itself into some monocultural social club that waves a Jesus banner. But that's not the church he designed. God has obviously called us to be so much more than that. So, What does that look like? Like how do we manifest that? How do we manifest that consideration for others across barriers, and particularly across a barrier like language? I want to give you just kind of 4 brief ways that we consider others more significantly than ourselves in a multilingual church. The first is we consider one another more significant than ourselves by using our times of corporate worship to serve and care for one another as one family. You see, corporate worship was never designed to be a time where I find my perfect experience. It was never designed to cater to my own desires, to make life about me. It's corporate worship. It's about us, and it's about the usness of us. It's a time where we serve one another. It's a time where we make one another feel at home. And we do this in all sorts of different ways. We do it by using a variety of music styles from different time periods, right? Some of us love worship music from the 90s, so we get to sing those songs sometimes. We do this by using a variety of preaching styles. We do this by trying to take our entire family into consideration when we're planning and preparing, not just the largest subgroup. Actually, when we serve one another, we kind of have this idea. I mean, as pastors, we talk about it. We kind of have this idea that we hope that we kind of play it like a 70-30 rule. We kind of hope that 70% of the time you're like, this is great. This is exactly what I need. And 30% of the time you're like, this isn't what I would have chosen. Because you have to. If we're going to be in a church with one another, providing opportunities to serve one another and to care for one another. Because then it's not just, oh, this isn't what I would have chosen. This is what a joy that I can enter in this way for the sake of the brothers and sisters that are sitting around me. Over the past number of years, God's orchestrated, as we try to figure out how to do this well, God's orchestrated to bring pastors here whose heart languages are the same heart languages as some of the largest non-English speaking groups in this part of our city. And we're like, obviously you're doing something here. And so because of that, one powerful way we can serve one another is to offer worship services in languages other than English. And so this is how God led us to first start a Spanish service and now a Farsi service. However, if we're truly one church family, we also believe that we should also find ways to worship together. And we've tried a number of different things over the years, but this is why the best we know right now is our Unity Sunday. This is why we do Unity Sundays every 6 to 8 weeks. So that at the 11 o'clock, we can worship together in English and Spanish. At the 5 o'clock, we can worship together in English and Farsi. And even if this isn't ideal, right, and it's not ideal, we're trying to find better ways to do that. Our 9 a.m. service doesn't even get that opportunity to love and serve one another in that way, or even experience the joy of that. And so we're working on finding a way to worship together. I mean, our goal, and we're just a couple of logistical hurdles away. Our goal is to have a couple of times a year, have one big worship service in English and simultaneously translated into Spanish and Farsi in all sorts of different ways. Actually, we got some little technology here. These are the cheap version of being at the UN, right? You're like, we're going to figure this out. But even if this isn't ideal, we're pursuing for ways to do this. Another way to do this is for you to join our Spanish service or our Farsi service any given Sunday. The first application of this is starting so next week we're going to have a Unity Sunday. The week after that, starting 2 weeks from now, we're going to have live translation in both of our Spanish and Farsi services into English through this. So that you can show up and it'll be varying degrees of accuracy as we grow, but you can show up and worship and know what's going on, what's being happening, and you can join in worship with our Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters, with our Farsi-speaking brothers and sisters. And I mean, if you're bilingual and speak a different language other than that, and maybe you're a part of a bilingual and you're part of a community that there's a large portion of people around in this area too that need to hear the gospel, that could be drawn to. Maybe there's ways we could start translation ministries here as a part of our English service through that. But actually, which leads us to the second way we can love one another as a part of our multilingual church. The second way is we consider one another more significant than ourselves by using our gifts to serve and care for one another as one family. Use our gifts to serve one and care for one another as one family. I mean, we want to encourage you to look for ways that you can use your gifts to serve not just a part of your family, but our entire family. I think this might actually be a helpful thought experiment. When you think about the ways that you're using your spiritual gifts to bless others in the body. Right? Whether it's your gift of teaching or gift of service or gift of hospitality or gift of administration. Who are the people that are most often blessed by your spiritual gifts? Are they all people really similar to you? Or are the people blessed by your spiritual gifts as diverse as our church family actually is? Now, of course, everybody can't do everything, but I think it's a way that we can view God's church to say, Lord, how do you want to use me for the sake of our whole church? And there's already a number of practical ways that lots of you are already doing this. Right? One huge way is in the context of our children's ministry. Right? While our worship services are in English and Spanish and Farsi, our children's ministry is all in English. Because growing up here, no matter what language your parents speak, the kids are inevitably being educated in English. This is actually another important reason why we believe it's so important to be one multilingual church. The vast majority of people who are here whose heart language is something other than English is because they grew up in a place, maybe in a country, where the primary language was something other than English. But if they're here now and their kids are growing up here now, chances are that their children are going to have a different heart language than their parents, which is one of the biggest challenges for monolinguistic kind of ethno-specific churches, right? If we're a church that speaks one language because this is the community that's here, the question is always, and has always been, how in the world do we pass the gospel on to the next generation as a church body when they speak a different language, when they're engaging with the world in a different language and in a different culture? And we want to do everything we can to help bridge that gap. Then there's all sorts of other opportunities here. There's opportunities to tutor kids from families who don't speak English. We have a tutoring that's ongoing. I mean, with the school year is going to start back up. We're tutoring. We want to start back up when the school year starts back up in August, September. I mean, some of you know how difficult it is to help your kids with their homework. Try helping your kids with their homework when it's in a different language than you speak. Right? There's just a fundamental challenge there. There's an opportunity to teach ESL, to help others learn English. There's opportunities to teach computer skills to people who aren't used to navigating that. Really, whatever your skills or gifts are, there's ways for you to bless others with those gifts right here as a part of our family. And thirdly, if we use our gifts to bless one another, we consider one another more significant than ourselves by using our resources to bless one another as one family. God's calling us to use our resources to bless one another as one family. Often, but not always, but more often than not, those whose heart language is other than English in our city will lack the resources that many of us whose first language is English may possess. Of course, there can be numerous exceptions to this, but I think it's fair as a generalization. And if you just think about it, if there's a group of 50 to 100 English speakers gathered together, Christian English speakers gathered together, there's a decent, in West LA, a group of 50 to 100 English speakers in West LA, there's a decent chance, a really good chance, that those 50 to 100 people are going to be able to financially free up a pastor who will be able to teach and shepherd them, train, invest in their lives, and disciple and equip them. However, that's generally much less true for a group of 50 to 100 people who primarily speak Spanish or who primarily speak English in our city as well. This is one of the reasons that our church budget reflects this kind of multilingual investment. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. And instead of only providing programs and services that directly benefit those who provide the majority of those resources, we want to be a church who's continually asking the question, how do not just I as an individual love others, how do we as a body, how do we as a family love others and cross barriers and serve others and invest in and bless other portions of the family God is building here? It makes me think of 1 Timothy 6, which I love. It's such a helpful vision for our lives. He says, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They're to do good, to be rich in good works, and to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up a treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. We believe that both individually and as a church, striving for generosity, striving to love and care for others is the means by which we take hold of that which is truly life, which makes it actually not a sacrifice at all because of what we get to see and what God is doing in and through us. But at the same time, don't let our church budget be the only way that you use your resources to serve and care for one another as a part of our multilingual family. There are countless opportunities to do so interpersonally as well. There's always individual opportunities to care for one another in the body. I mean, just think about it this way. What would you do if your brother or sister or cousin moved to Los Angeles without a job or a place to stay? Right? You'd probably do whatever you could to help them. You'd probably invite them into your home. You'd probably help them get a job. You'd probably find a way to make sure they were taken care of. Why? Because they're family. Don't miss the reality of what it means to be a part of God's local church here in West LA. There are brothers and sisters of ours who are regularly moving into our city. Some have plenty of means to live here and have different needs, but some don't. Whatever language they speak, how can we use our resources to help and bless and care for one another? Galatians 6, Paul reiterates this in Galatians 6, verse 9 and 10. He says, and let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then we have an opportunity. Let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. We are family. But I think the biggest question that comes up, even with that, tends to be, okay, like I'm willing, like I want to care for and bless others, but how do I know how to help? Like how do I know what's most needed, right? How do I know what someone needs when we don't speak the same language, right? Some of you are still frustrated with me, it's okay. Right, but we don't speak the same language, which I think leads us to our final point. Even in spite of that, we consider one another as more significant than ourselves by pursuing genuine relationships, even across barriers. The single greatest way you can love others who are a part of our beautiful multilingual family is to take the time to get to know them and build relationships across all barriers, including language. Which I think does still it hits the nail on the head on the single biggest hurdle I imagine you're thinking about, which is how can I have a relationship with someone when we don't speak the same language? So let me kind of close us up with 3 suggestions to help you build relationships with people who speak a different language than you. Number 1, lean on people who function as bridges in our church. Lean on those who are bridges. Not only do we have a lot of English speakers here, not only do we have a lot of Spanish speakers here, we also have a lot of bilingual speakers here. Chances are you probably know someone who's bilingual already. They may be in your community group, you may be friends already. Lean on them, ask them to help you build relationships and get to know people across the linguistic barrier. And if you're bilingual, God has given you that ability to be a unique bridge in His church, Just like all the other sovereign ways and sovereign people that God has brought to build his church here together, you are one of those people. You are one of the means God has provided here, one of the gifts he's given to his body. And God has placed you here as a part of his church for many different reasons, but I imagine that your ability to bridge languages is one of them. So firstly, we can build relationships through and by leaning on those who serve as bridges in our midst. Secondly, we can build relationships across linguistic barriers by recognizing that many of the Spanish speakers, Farsi speakers, and even other language speakers in our midst have already taken significant steps to come towards us. Many of our brothers and sisters who have different heart languages have worked hard and are working hard to learn English and to be able to communicate with you. I think sometimes we just imagine or kind of picture this as like some type of like impenetrable wall. Like, I don't know. I don't even know how to test it. So I'm not even gonna like walk near it. But 95% of both the Spanish speakers and the primarily Spanish speakers and primarily Farsi speakers in our church, 95% of them speak some English. Like, it's not zero or nothing. In fact, 70% of our Farsi speakers are some level of fluent. 15% of our Spanish speakers are some form of fluent. I mean, we're estimating here. But about that. And oftentimes, I think sometimes when we're building relationships, we sense a reticence with those whose first language isn't English, and we assume the reticence is based on their inability to speak English. But far more often, their reticence is about an insecurity about the quality of their English. Far more often, actually, their reticence is about how they've been treated by other primarily English speakers in our culture. We have to recognize that. We have to know that and not assume that if this is a little bit hard or awkward for you, it's because you can't or won't. But there's tons of opportunity because of the significant ways that so many of our brothers and sisters in Christ have come towards us who primarily or only speak English. Because of the efforts they've made, there's all sorts of opportunities. And this doesn't just, I've alluded to it, but this doesn't just go for Spanish or Farsi speakers either. Many of you here, your first language wasn't English. And we don't want to take for granted the hard and sacrificial work you've undertaken to be able to sit and engage and worship together with us and engage with us and have relationships with one another in a language that's not your first. Regardless, in all these different ways, there are ways we consider others of any heart language more significant than ourselves, not treating them as if they're less significant than ourselves. And thirdly, the third way we can build relationships across linguistic barriers is to take steps to move towards those who speak a different language than you yourself. Oftentimes in monolingual churches, like, we'd love to disciple you, we'll wait around. Once you know English, you are welcome. But we want to fight and strive to communicate something different than that. If the barrier is that you don't know the heart language someone else speaks, you have an opportunity to make an effort to learn even just some basic phrases, even just a greeting, just even ways to initiate conversations in ways that will open up people, and you struggling to try will provide an opportunity and the openness for them to struggle and try in your language as well, to show them that it's okay, that we're going to kind of work through this together. You have no idea how much love and respect and honor is communicated when you make an effort to communicate, even in a simple way, to those who have a different heart language. Start by just learning some phrases. You do it when you travel, right? Like, whether it's a vacation or a missions trip, or anything. If you've ever been in a place where people speak a different language than English, like, you download an app. right? Like you learn some phrases, you get some basics down, you try to find a basic way to like engage with people, to open up, to even start conversations, to communicate some basics about how you feel about them. We do it for highly valued visitors, right? If someone famous or have high honor were to come and stay with you in your home, you'd probably prepare at least by learning how to greet them in their own language. Why wouldn't you at the very least, do the same for our brothers and sisters in Christ? We have a huge opportunity. And it opens doors for them to be able to speak opens the door for them to fight through the English they've learned too, so that you can engage and share, and again, like just begin a relationship and see what the Lord does with that. I mean, if you look like me, you start like a greeting and then they just speak their language thinking you speak it, right? But I don't speak Spanish or Farsi. Farsi is the one that I get all the time. Once I learned like some basic Farsi phrases, everybody's like, I have no Persian in me at all. So I've learned that in Farsi as well. I need to learn that. And to communicate to you, I'm not Persian. But with those phrases, with the knowledge that the person you're speaking with, the reality is that and the knowledge that the person you're speaking with may know at least some English, we have opportunities for relationships. Whether it's just introducing yourself in the courtyard, whether it's asking a bilingual friend to introduce you to others in our body who you haven't met, whether it's visiting the Spanish or the Farsi service, whether it's pursuing those who you're serving in children's ministry with, or you're tutoring after school, or inviting families with kids, your kids' age, over and to parties and having parties together. There's a million ways this could work. And I know there's some awkwardness there. I know there's some I'm gonna have to push through. That's not the easiest opportunity to build a relationship. It's not easy building relationships with people it's easier to build relationships with people that are more like you, that share your heart language. To do this requires us taking a step and taking a risk. But the truth is, and guys, the fundamental truth is, it is easier for us to cross barriers as those who are fluent in the majority culture and a part and speaking the majority language than it is for those that are not. Being a part of the majority culture is a blessing. Speaking naturally, having always known the majority language spoken here is a blessing. Being able to catch every Seinfeld reference that flies by, it's a blessing. Right? Every cliche and figure of speech, not trying to have to struggle to be like, wait, what does that mean? It's a blessing. And we ought to use that blessing generously to find ways to be a blessing to others. I'm going to close with a story Pastor Jose told me just recently. He told me the story of how transformative his relationship with Becky's uncle was. So Jose, Pastor Jose, right, was from Guatemala. And his wife, Becky, grew up here. And it was quite a transition in Becky's family to have someone enter into the family whose first language wasn't English and who wasn't born in this country. That was new for them as a family. But Becky had an uncle, Paul, who really had a heart for Jose and kind of took him under his wing. And Paul would take the time to introduce Jose to everybody he knew. Whenever they were together, Paul wanted to introduce Jose to everyone he knew, that if Paul knew them, Jose would know them, right? So that he would make these connections and bring him in. And so, he knew, Paul knew that he was the ultimate insider in the family, and he knew that Jose could very easily be tempted to feel like an outsider in the family. And so he brought him into the fold, and he made the effort. But it wasn't just the fact that Paul introduced Jose to everyone he knew that was so transformative. It was how he introduced him. Because Paul always introduced Jose as my nephew Jose. every time Becky's Uncle Paul would introduce him, he would introduce him as my nephew Jose. He said, come here, I want you to meet my nephew Jose. Right, Bill, have you met my nephew Jose? And this kind of intimate intentionality, this kind of personal ownership that Paul took meant the world to Jose. He had never been treated like such an absolute insider in all of his years in the United States. He had never felt more like he actually belonged, even in all of his years in the church. It's not easy. It's not comfortable to be the one to make the effort and to take the steps forward to cross any barrier. And there's all sorts of barriers to cross here, particularly language. But it's good, and it's beautiful, and it's exactly what God has called us to together as his children. There are opportunities, and there will be opportunities for each one of us to use the blessings God has entrusted to us the way Uncle Paul did. To love others, to use them to serve others, to use them to care others and draw them in. And it starts with actually considering others more significant than ourselves. Let me pray.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.